Well, welcome everybody to this meeting of Progressive Christian Network of Victoria online. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this afternoon to give his second presentation of a series, and that man is Reverend John Power, who brings together a rich and diverse background in philosophy, theology, education, and psychotherapy. For over 35 years, he has served as an Anglican priest. He's a long-standing advocate for the emerging church and the evolution of theology, which is what he'll be talking to us about basically today. John is deeply committed to faith that involves with understanding. He was recently welcomed as a minister of the Word in the United Church, and currently he serves as a supply minister at Manningham Uniting Church. And I'm glad to be able to say that that's only for another week or so before he joins us at Stoniton Community Uniting Church as our minister in placement. And we're very glad of that. So please welcome John, and as he begins his address.
Thanks very much, Dick. So for those of you who were here last month, you might recall that my first talk was around the challenge that evolution has provided to the Christian faith, and particularly to the church. And just to recap, I was suggesting that it was such a great challenge because religion actually operates primarily by providing a worldview. It then populates that worldview with divine spirits, the presence of God, and gives you a whole lot of ways to connect with God, to relate to God, and to interact with the spiritual world. So the challenge particularly comes when the creation story, which in Christianity's case has been the story of Genesis, is flipped on its head and changed to a new creation story, which I've been suggesting to you was the theory of evolution. And when you change the creation story, you undermine, I suppose, the house of cards to a certain degree. And that's why the church has been struggling in the last couple of centuries. And I gave you a whole list of ways in which the church has responded to that challenge. And if you haven't caught up with that talk, I think Dick has placed an account of that talk on the website. But today I want to particularly focus in on the second question, which is not so much the problem, but much more centered around the possible solution. So evolution has certainly created a challenge for the church, which we talked about last time. But this time, let's explore the possibility that evolution can actually be the catalyst for change and the catalyst for response. So it's both the source of the challenge, but also the source of energy and the solution to that sort of challenge. What we're really trying to get at here is to see if I suppose, force and energy and power of evolution, which creates stars, creates life, and creates ecosystems, which generates adaptation and resilience, complexity in the world, whether that same force can actually help the church come to terms with this change in creation story and the subsequent, I suppose, loss authority in the general society. To do this, I'm going to talk about two primary metaphors. Now I know that the good folk at Manningham have heard me talk about the first one, which is the Sturt National Park. I'll beg your endurance here because I don't think you've heard me talk about the second one, which is structures of emergence. So firstly, thinking about how species actually evolve, I'm going to suggest to you that the Sturt National Park, which is in northern New South Wales, is actually a kind of living metaphor which we can draw some inspiration from. So it's one of those areas that are completely being denuded of Australian native species, particularly the eastern quoll, but also the famous Australian bilby, the stick nest rat, and a number of other native species have all been pretty much eliminated from that whole area of the sort of semi-desert of northern New South Wales. The culprits, of course, are typically wild cats, feral pigs, and also foxes. So the normal sort of invaders which humankind brought in with the European civilization. So the scientists wanted to repopulate that Sturt National Park with native species. And the first thing they did was to create a enclosure of some 40 acres out of 40 square miles out of some 400 square miles, which makes up the whole Sturt National Park. And so they completely enclosed it, got rid of all the predators, and proceeded to repopulate it with the quolls and with the bilbies. That met with great success. So not only the native animals, but of course, without so many kangaroos and things like that, also the whole um, flora, the grasses and native grasses and things like that sprung up, and the whole place has come alive. You can read about it if you'd like to Google Sturt National Park and the regeneration that's happened there. But they were a little bit more ambitious than that. Rather than just wanting to create a secure environment, their goal was to see if they could repopulate that 400 square mile of native park. Now, obviously, the problem is that those animals within that enclosure, if they were placed in the completely wild zone, would soon be decimated by those same predators. So their ingenious solution to this particular challenge was to create what they call a wild training zone. And for 100 square miles, they got rid of a number of the predators, but not completely. So they allowed enough to provide an evolutionary challenge to the quolls and to the bilbies. And this was also an interesting success. And they found that the quolls and the bilbies in that wild training zone, that intermediate area, were able to be much more predator aware. Also, that their whole physiology tended to change. Their muscles got a lot stronger, and they, on average, were a larger size than those they found in the completely protected zone. So really, we have three zones: completely protected zone, an intermediate zone, which I call the wild training zone, and a completely wild zone outside, where the predators were able to continue this process of extinction and completely wipe out any native species. So I'm going to draw a parallel here, if you allow me to do so, between what's happening in the church and what's happening in Sturt National Park. So we're used to this idea that if Christians, I suppose, don't have any support from the church, and if they're allowed in what we might call a competitive intellectual environment nowadays, they're going to perhaps become a little bit extinct. And that's because the primarily dominant worldview is what we might call scientific reductionism, which says that all mental and all, I suppose, aspects of meaning can be simply reduced to, and that's the idea of reductionism, simply reduced to the realm of physics. And in this sort of worldview, I suppose spirituality is seen as being more or less a human fantasy, and even the human thinking is seen as perhaps an added phenomena on top of what is a physical reality. In that kind of reductionist viewpoint, which very much is still a hangover from the Enlightenment, Christianity finds it really, really difficult to thrive. And so if people don't have any support from the church and they're out on their own, there's a tendency for the number of atheists in our community to grow and grow. Well, that would correspond to the, I suppose, completely uh, uh, wild zone out there where the predators, I suppose, are allowed to dominate. In response to that, I suppose the conservative church has gone down a path very similar to the first enclosed area, which they've done in Sturt National Park. I call it the zoo approach to church life. So realizing the threat of this reconfigured world view, which is based on the reductionism of modern science, the church has sought to protect its members. And I call it a kind of zoo zone because the clergy are seen as kind of zookeepers. So the idea is to perhaps gradually feed the people in the congregations with a diet they think that is able to be consumed and able to be digested, and this protection from the outside idea. And one of the interesting things about that is just like the scientists initially in the Sturt National Park, it's a kind of callback to the way things used to be. So if you think about the protected zone in Sturt National Park, they're trying to replicate what Australia was really like before the advent of predators. But that's impossible now, we know that. And it's just as impossible to get back to a church, which was the same as it was 200 years ago before the theory of evolution. So it's a kind of nostalgia attempt, that form of the church. The third parallel I'm going to draw is this idea of the wild training zone. It's that area of Sturt National Park where they allow some predators in, not enough to overwhelm the native species, but enough to bring about this energetic and dynamic, I suppose, evolutionary process as it's acting upon. It's really evolution viewing right before our eyes. The animals' limbs are changing, they're becoming more predator aware. So what I'm looking for in terms of the church is very much that wild training zone where there's actually enough pressure on the church to evolve. You know, we can't do we can't bring about those solutions consciously. Every bit of growth in the universe is actually not done consciously. It's brought about by subjecting the universe to evolutionary pressure. And I'm not saying this in a necessarily hard sense. I'm really talking about this as the way in which God operates in the universe, the way in which God creates. God creates through subjecting things to evolutionary pressure. And if we really want to see the church respond and change and renew, it needs to be in that position where it's which is exposed to evolutionary pressure. So my vision here is really a church which is has enough of the ideas of the world and the changes which have been brought about by the theory of evolution to shape people who are in the pews. Now, I guess the challenge really is if you went into the protected zone in Sturt National Park and asked the bilbies to vote on who would like to be part of the wild training zone, you really wouldn't get a huge number of volunteers. No one would and say, yes, I don't mind if you foxes chasing us, or I don't mind a few wild cats devouring me. I suppose it's a real call to courage, because to subject yourself to evolutionary pressure is to subject yourself to real danger. I think this is what really taps into this whole emphasis of Christianity on really sacrifice, on this whole idea of death and resurrection. It's like, in order to live, you have to be prepared to die. Whoever would want to save their life for my sake will lose it. Whoever would be prepared to lose their life for my sake will gain it. And you could really put Jesus' saying in these evolutionary terms, that unless you're prepared to submit yourself to some evolutionary pressure, the irony is that you're going to die out. So I suppose the danger is that the church enters a kind of bottleneck. And we call an evolutionary bottleneck when a population has its resources and its numbers have reduced down to the level where it's no longer a viable growing population. And it's a case is that the more we try and protect the church, the more we turn our churches into more like zoos, the less likely, in order to protect them, it's obviously designed for a good reason, but the more we want to protect them, the more we ensure their death. And that's the irony that you see in Sturt National Park. The more you want to protect the bilbies, and the more you want to protect the quolls and the stick-necked rats by having a complete enclosure, the more you ensure their extinction, because nothing can happen. It's interesting that there's a whole number of species which aren't able to breed in captivity, and our echidna is one of those animals. It's like in captivity, they can't access the instinct to survive. Try and breed an echidna in captivity, it's almost impossible, but they naturally breed, of course, out in the wild. And I think sometimes Christians can be a little bit like that, that the more we protect Christians in the name of securing the future of the church, the less fertile they are, the less able they are, of course, to be able to, I suppose, mix it intellectually with those out there. So you're very probably familiar with this idea that Christians who belong to conservative churches might be able to explain to you the four spiritual laws. They might be able to give a good account of their biblical theology, which only makes sense within that intellectual context. When you put them into an ordinary workplace, they haven't been able to practice this adapting their particular biblical, soteriological theology of salvation in a way which speaks to those who've been influenced by scientific reductionism and the theory of evolution. So really, when you think about it, the more we try and protect people in the church, the more we ensure that they die out. Okay, so that's one model. I'm going to talk about another way of approaching this, another way of finding, I suppose, energy and finding new structures in order for the church to be guided to participate in God's evolutionary power. The second comes not from the world of biology, but actually from the world of physics. And there are things called dissipative structures. Dissipative structures. It'll become clear as I give the main example. And that's a very simple one, is that when you empty your bathtub and you pull the plug, what happens? Immediately, a whirlpool evolves, I suppose, or comes into being in order to allow for the flow of water from the bathtub into the wider society, the wider drainage system. Where does that whirlpool come from? Well, it almost appears like magic, doesn't it, really? And it's quite a structured and organized phenomena. And it's obviously called a dissipative structure because these structures actually emerge when there is a movement of entropy, in other words, disorder, or there's a movement of information, or there is an unsteady state between two environments. Now, obviously, some of you are familiar with second law of thermodynamics, but often the early illustrations of that were talked about steady states where you've got a room filled with air and it just spread throughout the room. But here we're talking about environments where there's quite a marked difference between states of entropy. And where there's a marked difference between states of entropy, you get the creation of these dissipative structures, such as the whirlpool. It's really order emerging from energy flow and from disruption. I hope you can begin to see the attraction of this sort of dissipative structure. So where there is a disruption and where there is a large gap between two states, such as the church and the world, the theory goes that you don't have to consciously create an environment where the church is renewed or restructured. Evolution, which is God's creative form and creative medium, will automatically appear, which is for us, I suppose, ministers, a wonderful hope that we won't have to do all the work or reorganize the structure. Really, it's saying that if you allow, again, the evolutionary forces to actually take hold, God, through evolution, will create the structures to do this. What we hope then is that this is a slightly different metaphor, that the church will become a kind of whirlpool, an evolving, dissipative, emergent structure which looks after the flow from one environment to the other. Here, I think, is really important to understand that one of the most important flows happening here between the church and society is the flow of information. Now, I don't want to go into technicalities about the role information plays in matter, but let's just say that one of the things that flows through that bathtub is information as well as energy and as well as water. So the idea here is that if you can have a flow of information from the dominant worldview that society has into the church, then that will be like that bathtub emptying. It's the flow of information. So when you open up your church to the culture and the dominant worldview and the information in that scientific worldview, and evolution, I think, is a prime example of that. When you open up the church to all the intricacies of the theory of evolution, the flow of information will structure your church naturally. And I'm going to suggest to you this is God's recreative action of the church in time. So there's a flow both of information from the world in terms of the capacity the church has to explore science, to explore philosophy. That information flows in, and by its flow, it's creating that whirlpool of structure, which the church is, which is an energetic flow structure, which is dissipating that information from society into the church. But there's also a flow which happens back the other way. So remembering that one of the roles which that religion plays in society is religion has evolved to make people's experience of the universe sacred. I repeat that, religion has evolved to make people's experience of the universe sacred. That's our kind of main evolutionary purpose. So this flow can happen two ways. Think about it flowing, the information about the worldview based on evolution and science flowing into the church. And what flows, what the church is able to do is to point out how that is sacred, how it is meaningful, how it actually fits into the whole history of mankind's search for meaning, how it fits into the tradition, how it fits into the whole evolution of human understanding of the divine and human understanding of meaning. And this can be, I think, the church's transformative offering back into the world. So think about the church being able to take in the information about evolution and to be able to give it meaning and to be able to point out where it's sacred and to be able to offer it back to the world. And I think this is a really important point, because at the moment we're in that place where there's a huge debate going on within physics and the whole theory of evolution about, is evolution directional? Does it have any purpose? Is there a place for meaning? All those questions, I think, are really being thrown open at the moment in the kind of intellectual environment. And the church, therefore, has a huge offering it can make in that environment, saying, yes, we actually believe that evolution is sacred. It is God's way of interacting with the universe. It has a direction, it has a teleology, and it has a purpose. So that's the second kind of metaphor, I suppose, I'd like to offer to you today, which offers us the possibility that we don't have to sit down and think about how we're going to renew the church, that actually if we are willing to allow the church to operate under God's evolutionary influence, then these structures will begin to appear. So I guess in many ways, that's a kind of, both of those are a call to kind of courage in many ways. It's a call to kind of leave behind the discomfort, to be prepared to enter into discomfort and leave behind this sort of idea of the church as a protected zone, as a sort of a zoo, which the clergy kind of, or the theologians are gatekeepers. And it's a call, I suppose, to have a vision for being adventurous and even sacrificial, to be an evolving and spirit-led. So here is the identification really of the Holy Spirit working in an evolutionary way. In traditional, of course, Christian theology, it was the role of the Spirit to sustain creation. So it's this idea that God as creator set the whole thing up and in motion, and it was given the Holy Spirit's role to kind of sustain in creation. But in this evolutionary model, we're talking here about the Spirit's role, not so much to sustain a static evolutionary universe, but to actually be involved as the energy, the spirit as the energy behind evolution, which is pushing us forward to grow, change, and develop. More than that, you can begin to see, as we talked about these dissipative structures, we're really talking about a continued creation, which is happening through evolution. So our picture of the church is really a church which is continually being created, just as the whirlpool is continually being created by the flow of water. So the church is really continually being created by the flow of information from society, its capacity to make that sacred, to make it purposeful, to give it meaning, which is religion's primarily role, and to offer it back. And you can begin to see that you've got, therefore, the implication that as soon as the church stops doing that flow, and as soon as the church wants to put up the bulwarks and protect itself, it's going to become a backwater. It no longer becomes a whirlpool, it becomes a stagnant pool. Yeah, because its ongoing life, its ongoing existence as a whirlpool depends upon the movement of information and the, I suppose, capacity for the church to offer meaning and a sense of the sacred to that worldview. Two quite different, I suppose, views of the church. One is a much more traditional and static view. God has created the church in its being, and upon that rock, and you'll notice there, this is a favourite metaphor of Rome, this sort of static rock whereby the world just is like a boat and smashes against the rock. A very static view of the church, which has to therefore be protected by its doctrine, protected by its theologians, because the church is this sort of rock which continues on through the ages. It's almost an opposite vision of the church, where the church only exists where there is a flow of information. The church is from society. The church then, very existence becomes entirely dependent upon its capacity to interpret and be open to the particular worldview of the day. If its church is not open to that worldview, then it ceases to be in existence. Just like our whirlpool is going to immediately disappear once the difference between the water in the tub and the water and the empty space of the drainage disappears. It's really saying that without that kind of unsteady state where there's two particular states which are quite different, you don't get a flow of creation, you don't get a flow of energy. Okay, really then, two metaphors which are designed to help us see it's not up to us to renew the church. It's actually something which the Holy Spirit does. The Holy Spirit does it just as the species are constantly evolving and changing and developing. You know, I was a bit reminded of what's happening with the wild cats in Australia. The original tabby cats, which are brought across with the early settlers, were let loose in the wild. And if you've seen the pictures of cats, they look much more like mountain lions in the outback now. They're 2 to 3 times the size, and they're something like 30 kilograms. What we're really doing is seeing the evolution of a new subspecies, and probably eventually the evolution of a new species of cat. It'll be Felis australis. In other words, what scientists couldn't do intentionally, create a new species, God does through his process of evolutionary creation. If you put these cute little cats into the environment, And over 100 years, it's not the cats which are recently escaped from homes, it's the ones that have been there from the beginning that are actually undergoing the evolutionary change. And as soon as those wildcats begin to view the average home held tabby not as a mate but as a future meal, then you'll get the separation of the species and creation of a new species. In other words, we don't have to socially engineer the church. All we have to do is ensure that the church is placed in a evolutionary environment, and the spirit through evolution will do all the work for us. Same idea that comes out of your dissipative structure, which is your whirlpool in the bathtub. We don't have to, and we actually wouldn't be able to create a whirlpool. If you think about it, the physics behind the creation of whirlpool are way beyond the capacity of human beings. In other words, all we have to do is subject our bath to evolutionary pressure, really, through entropy and the different flows that entropy undertakes and information undertakes. And the evolutionary God spontaneously produces the type of structure which will facilitate the dissipation of entropy. And there's some, I suppose, suggestions and explorations, a way of looking at the whole of life as another sort of dissipatory structure, as a way in which the universe more efficiently disperses entropy. So here's, I think, a great source of hope for me anyway. The church, in the face of evolution, actually doesn't have to retreat. It doesn't have to put up the barricades. And but actually, by engaging with the evolving world and with the whole theory of evolution and what's happening in science, the church can actually not only grow itself, find renewal, but become an important element in that evolutionary train. Because if you think about it, evolution has also, in God, produced religion. In other words, one way of thinking about it is that evolution in God has thrown up religion in order that human beings, in order that the consciousness of the universe can appreciate the sacredness of the whole of being, the sacredness of the universe. So again, once we recognize the evolutionary purpose of religion and we submit ourselves to it, there's nothing we have to do really. It's just allow God to work in and through us by the power of the Spirit. Well, I'm going to conclude there my talking to you and throw open for questions, if I may.
Not sure. Can you hear me, John? Christopher Page.
Yep.
Yep. Okay. I haven't got a picture for some reason or other. John, is evolution in reverse? That is, it always sounds as if it's moving forward, but is there some evolution that stopped at certain points, or, for example, that the whales turned back and went from dinosaurs into the ocean? Is that a theory, or have I just heard that from someone?
That's a great question, Chris. And I think it has quite a complex answer, really. So no, evolution doesn't really go backwards itself. So You could look at the land animals going back, into the ocean as a devolution, which is the opposite of evolution. But another way of looking at it is it's actually just another step in evolution, that they're adapting to a new environment.
Yeah.
And in a similar way, you've also got some multicellular animals, some slimes and things like that, which go from being multicellular to being singular cellular. But I don't think the scientists would call that devolution, really. They would say it's just another step in adapting to a particular environment.
Yeah.
So I think one of the answers, and I mean, there may be others who disagree with that, and it's an interesting and perhaps slightly contentious point. One of the reasons it can't go backwards is because of the way in which entropy works. So entropy goes in one direction. In one sense, it winds down, but in its winding down, its flow of entropy always produces greater complexity, and our whirlpool is an example of this. So in one sense, entropy is only going one direction, but in its flow of entropy, it's actually creating evolution and complexity. So it's quite a complex situation where you do have a entropy working in the universe, but the consequence of entropy working is really evolution. So you've got the two hand in hand, which makes a fascinating, I suppose, dynamic. And I think the scientists and philosophers are really coming to terms with this as well. So I think that's really interesting when we would begin to apply it to the church. You would really say, okay, and certain species, you can say, okay, well, we certainly know there's extinction, both within particular congregations and also within species. So it might look as though evolution is coming to a dead end in one particular corner. But again, when you look at the whole picture, the loss of one species in environment or the loss of one part of the church should automatically flow into the growth or renewal of another. Great question.
Thank you. That's helpful. One more question.
Sure.
We human beings seem to be able to move forward in mind, and that is in intellect and so forth. And that's very slow. That's taken thousands of years, whereas physical evolution taken millions of years.
Yeah. So it's interesting, isn't it? And one way of approaching this might be to think about evolution happening on an informational level. So what's evolving is informational. Now, that information can evolve in a number of different ways. It can evolve through DNA, which is its physical structure. But DNA takes a long time to alter. Okay, it happens over hundreds of thousands of years, really. So there's limitations in the rate in which physical evolution can happen. But other ways in which information can evolve is actually through culture. So if you think about culture as a repository of shared information, that can actually evolve a lot quicker because it's not subject to the same slow evolutionary rules that biological structures are.
Yeah.
So you can think about evolution as having that common thing, that what is really evolving is on an informational level. The rate at which it can evolve depends upon the carrier of that information. In the case of physical universe, that obviously slower. In the case of cultural or intellectual, it can happen a lot quicker and also accelerate. So one way of looking at that, of course, is the whole advent of AI and the whole advent of the World Wide Web. And T.R. de Chardin referred to this as he talked about the noosphere. And he pointed out this very thing that information can evolve a lot more quickly when it moves from the sphere of the physical into the sphere of the information age.
Thank you, John. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Any other questions?
John, Michael here. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, great. You might have remembered, John, last week I talked about Frederic Laloux.
Yep.
That's the illustrated version. Take you an hour, John, to read that. Clever fellow like you. This is this one's the big book. This is the lovely new 10-year book. And that's 350 pages, so that'd take you probably a weekend to read. But look, I agree entirely with what you're saying, pretty much because it accords very much with Laloux. If I want to throw a spanner in the works, though, most of the institutions we know are level 4. Now, what you're describing is very much a level 4 amber sort of organisation, which has rules and regulations and looks after itself. Now, what Frederic, nice Belgian fellow, is advocating is level 7. Now, as you can work out, going from 4 to 5 to 6 to 7 is quite a jump. Now, what you're advocating is sort of a level 7 sort of realisation, which is quite a jump. And so you've not said this, but it is going to take time, isn't it, to move on?
Well, it is, but my hope is that it happens quicker than we think. And so, I'm using the wildcats in Australia as an example, so that you might say, okay, well, really, to create a new species of cat would normally say, okay, how long? We might say a couple of million years. But I think this old-fashioned idea that evolution happens slowly turns out not to be correct. What happens is that evolution goes slowly when there's a stable environment, but as soon as this environment changes, it happens quite rapidly. And I think this is what we have to come to terms with, is we have to realize that if we dynamically and purposely change the environment, evolution can happen a lot more quickly than we think it can.
That's right. Yeah, you've seen the work on, sorry, John, you've seen the work on foxes, the Russians with their foxes. They got foxes, and they got nice foxes, and they mated them. They got nicer foxes. And so the foxes became more and more dog-like. Now, curiously, this morning, John, I was out and about early in the morning. What do I see? This strange-looking beast. And I go, what the hell is that? And it's a tiny fox. Here in the suburbs, we have evolved small foxes that can wriggle through fences and chicken coops and things like that. And interestingly enough, they're sort of silvery too, these foxes. And I thought, that's interesting. That's counterintuitive. You think of a nocturnal animal would be dark or something to hide. But no, these foxes are so brazen and bold. I mean, it was looking at me going, just looking at me like this, And it was totally unafraid of me. He goes, yeah, I'm a suburban dweller, mate. I'm here to enjoy life.
Yeah. Well, again, I think it comes down to this, we have an old world view of evolution that we were taught at school, where evolution happened only through random mutations of genes, and therefore it always happened at pretty much the same pace because it's dependent upon random mutations. But that turns out actually not to be true. It turns out that with epigenetics, I think this comes through, that there is a feedback system, and this is part of what the church needs to do in terms of helping people come to terms with the purpose and speed of evolution, is that if you change the environment, then you speed up evolution. So just coming back to this idea of moving your organization from a level 4 to a level 7, I'm not so familiar with those categories, but it's to say it just doesn't have to take the time of mutation. There's ways in which you obviously can structure it. So again, coming back to this example of the Sturt National Park, it was the intention of the rangers of that park that produced that evolutionary shift. And as soon as they created the environment for it to happen, it began to happen. So those of us who have a key role in any organization, I think, can take a great deal of heart from that, that if we create the wild training zones, or we create the flow of information, God's Spirit will start acting in ways which are much more quicker than we could ever imagine.
I think that's exactly right.
Mm.
Anything else? Come on, you're being too easy on me.
I'm wondering how the world will hear the church when we speak about meaning and a sacred universe. How will they accept the credibility of that story? What process of accepting what you're talking about in terms of meaning and sacred universe to the world at large?
Great question, Gail. Look, there's going to be resistance, obviously. There is a huge investment in this idea that life is fundamentally meaningless and that the whole process of evolution has just happened by chance, and it continues to happen by random chance mutations. So there's, I suppose, a huge investment in that worldview. So there is obviously going to be some resistance to it, but nonetheless, we're not alone in that. The more I read into the literature of evolution, the more I see it's not just obviously the church, but it's the philosophers who are doing a lot of that work on meaning as well. So that we're entering, not just creating that dialogue, we're actually entering into a dialogue which is already happening in the world of the philosophy of evolution, if I may call it. So I think that's encouraging. So I suppose we've got common course with the philosophers in their sense of the search for meaning in the midst of this process of evolution, but we also have something unique. And that uniqueness, again, comes back to this sacralization. It's our particular role in the evolutionary spectrum to add to the sacredness. Look, again, it's not necessarily going to be easy. And I think this is where, finding bilbies and quolls who are going to vote to enter into the wild training zone is going to be a challenge. They're going to want to stay safe from the predators. But it's kind of like saying, well, that's the field we actually have to enter into. There is nowhere else where God is, because if God is a God of evolution, God is always on the cutting edge of the world as it changes and grows. An evolutionary God is always evolving with reality. He cannot live in the past. And I'm reminded there of when Jesus was in the debate about the resurrection, and Jesus was saying to them, look, can God be the God of David and Moses and they be dead? No, because God is always a God of the living. In other words, God only exists really in the present, is perfectly present in the present, really. And so it's kind of like there is no choice for us. God is there evolving the universe. God's Spirit is the force behind that evolution. So if we want to be engaged with God, we have to be engaged with that process. And it is exciting and it's interesting. And even though it's dangerous, there's that sense of you're let out of your cage. You're no longer in the zoo. While there is a risk for those bilbies leaving the protected zone, there's also energy in being wild and free. And my hope is that as we embrace that, we'll find ourselves re-energized within the church as well.
Thanks, John.
John Nowak, I think. Do you have a question, John?
Right, I've unmuted myself. Yes, the question I have is that you mentioned scientific reductionism, applying it to the realm of physics, and you mentioned spirituality then is reduced to human fantasy. But in fact, a person like Carl Jung wouldn't have called it that at all. He would have called it meaningful myth and related it to the archetypal dimension of the unconscious as a very vital element within our spiritual lives. So scientific reductionism isn't all that helpful when it comes to deeper spirituality. But my a further question is that I'm wondering if there could actually be a religious reductionism that you've practiced here today. Usually with religion, you have the two concepts of God and supernatural, and I've heard them discussed a lot here at Progressive Christianity. God is sort of it's a problem because there are so many concepts of God, and they're described as invisible, intangible. In other words, they're very hard to actually pinpoint and to deal with empirically. But you've called him the creative principle. And on the other hand, there's also the issue of supernatural that people find uncomfortable. You know, you can explain natural, but if you come into supernatural, then it involves miracles and arbitrary sort of things. But you have mentioned that the Holy Spirit could be seen as the energizing principle. Now, my question after all that is, are you actually dealing with the Holy Spirit and the God as a creative principle, the Holy Spirit as an energizing principle, in a religiously reductionistic manner? In other words, you're reducing it to very clear scientific principles that are in practice, which doesn't leave much independent room for the existence of God or the Holy Spirit.
Okay, good point. The question being, am I kind of involved in a reductionism? Well, I'm really speaking out of a viewpoint which dissolves any distinction between the supernatural and the natural. Not in the way which says there is no supernatural, but in a way which says that the things which we normally call natural are God infused. In other words, this process of evolution is God at work. So I hear what you're saying, and no, I'm not really trying to reduce it down, but I hear what you're saying, that if I do away with the distinction between the natural and the supernatural, in one sense, it is a kind of reduction going on because it's a dissolution of the categories. And that could be seen as a kind of reduction, but that's just one way of looking at it. What it's, I suppose, really coming out of that evolutionary Christian tradition, which says nature is my scripture, and that evolution is God at work, and the consciousness of which flows in and through the universe is also identified with the consciousness which flows in and through God. So I hear what you're saying, but I think for me, there is a huge value in dissolving that distinction between the natural and supernatural. Now, it's quite different to the reductionists because they dissolve it and say, actually, everything is natural and there is no supernatural. Whereas I'm kind of dissolving it in another way. I'm saying, well, actually, I'm going to dissolve the distinction, but everything is supernatural. In other words, everything that we see is really the unfolding of the becoming of God. So I'm kind of with you halfway, but I'm going to still stick with my viewpoint and make its point that yes, a kind of reduction of categories, but also done with a particular spiritual emphasis and purpose. I hope that kind of covers some of what you're talking about.
Well, there's just one little aspect that I'd like to add there with this, the concept of the sacred. You see, a lot of people like that word and they want to restore a sacred element to the universe, but they're dealing more with a sort of sense of awe, and they'll tell you to go out and absolutely appreciate nature, quite apart from whether it was a supernatural being that created it, get in touch with nature and feel the sanctity and the the sacred nature of life, death, birth, nature, everything like that. So it's more a mental attitude, I would say, than actually expecting a supernatural dimension. That's just that's how a lot of people deal with it.
I think you're right about that, but I think one way of approaching it is when it comes to God, it's really about the question of how do you name that sacred? In other words, yes, I'm acknowledging that you're experiencing the sacredness of the universe, and then when you look at the stars, you had this experience of the sacredness of the universe and the beauty of nature. So when it comes to the question of God, is how do you name it? How do you describe it? So I am suggesting that the sense of sacred is a path into the nature of what we experience and what we call God. So we're just kind of, I suppose, in my mind, delving greater into the nature of that sacredness, the naming of it and the describing of it. And we're using the word God to describe I suppose, the essential nature of why that experience of sacred is there and what's actually causing it. So interesting. But I think nonetheless, your very point points out that it's worth exploring that language with people because it's one they begin to readily identify. And once you can begin to ask them the questions about, well, where do you think that sense of sacredness comes from? And how would you name it? How would you describe it? What's its role in your own life? What's its role in the history of culture? What's its role in evolution, I guess, is one of the questions I'm asking. If they believe in evolution, then they've got to believe that the sense of the sacred has a role in evolution. And I'm interested in exploring that as a church with them. Great question. Now, I'm aware that we've sort of gone past the hour. So I'll throw back to the curator of the session and check into how we're going.
I'm more than happy to keep you. Dick, you want to speak?
No, carry on.
Oh, I'd say I think people are happy to stay while you're interesting questions. We can keep recording.
Yep. Yes, if there's any more questions, I'm happy to take them and continue exploring.
Well, I have an idea. John, would it help to return to the question of whether evolution is static or moving? We, as mortals, are stuck with starting and finishing. And have we sort of over put that on the question of when we talk about it, evolution, rather than thinking of what I think is in the biblical record of an infinite and eternal God which has no beginning and end, and which is there present all the time. I'm just wondering if you'd like to play with that idea.
If I understand what you're exploring, one of the elements of it is this idea that we've had a kind of view of the eternalness of God as being a static thing, as sort of God exists before time and after time, and this idea that God is outside of time. And so it's kind of like God exists almost outside of evolution and pops into evolution for a while and then pops out again. Is that what you're getting at, or?
No, I wouldn't like to think that. Rather that.
Okay, can you perhaps rephrase it? What do you mean by static? Is evolution static?
It's our humanity that limits us seeing God, and the breadth of that reality. And so we implant on our tradition and our language, our scriptures, even an idea of beginning and end. But in fact, with God being eternal and infinite, there is no such thing. And that's sort of thing what we've got to come to grips with if we're looking for life in the mystery of the sacred.
Yeah. And well, I think from an evolutionary theology perspective, it comes down to this idea, again, which I was a little bit alluding to, that God's eternalness is an eternal becoming. And I think process theology is particularly interested in this idea of the becoming of God. So thinking about this idea that God is continually evolving with his universe because he's in intimate relationship with it. And just I can't be static in a relationship that I have with you, because as soon as you change, I must change, because I'm a relational being. That the Trinity tells us that God is a relational being, and therefore God must be evolving as his universe evolves. Yes, and it's the idea that there won't just be one universe. It was probably this one does come to an end. There'll be one which evolves out of this one as well. So it's this idea that God's eternalness is not a static eternalness, but God's eternalness is a eternal evolution. God is always becoming, and always has to be, because the idea of a static God is a God that's really incapable of relationship. And this is why an old traditional view of God tends to lead towards atheism, because it views God as transcendent and outside of time, and therefore easily just cut off and almost, I suppose, non-existent, because it really needs what I think is an evolutionary viewpoint of God to bring back faith. Because if God is always in a relationship with us, the relation of God is always evolving alongside his creation. So his evolution is an expression of his coming into being in relationship with us. I hope that kind of approaches some of the topics we were just talking about.
Good.
Hey, John, I hope you don't mind me asking a little bit more about the idea of adaptation. We know the symptoms, I guess, now, thanks to you, of a bilby undergoing evolution. We know that it's stronger and that it's that it weighs a little bit more, which is heartening. Can you tell us something about the symptoms of an evolving church?
Great question. So one thing I did allude to was this idea of information flow. And this came up when we were talking about structures of dissipation, dissipative structures. So it seems to me that a evolving church is always open to the flow of information from society and from the cutting edge of science. So I'm not just talking historically here, because again, this idea that society really exists on the cutting edge of its own growth. Now, if I go to most churches, the sermon I hear is a biblical exposition. And I'm by no means against that, because the current development has to be put in relationship to the biblical tradition. But when the current situation is almost left out, I think you have a church which has become a stagnant pool rather than a whirlpool. So I think that flow of information is essential to an evolving church. And I think that means that it's also not the role of the clergy to be acting as zookeepers. In other words, kind of doling out easy food for people and protecting them from the ravages of the world outside. And I often, I was involved in the training of clergy in the Newcastle Diocese in the Anglican Church. I often got that sense of what was involved, is that this idea that we had to kind of protect these poor parishioners from the ravages of modern atheism and the environment. So I think part of the evolving church is a movement of the clergy away from being zookeepers and trying to protect people and feed them. Feed them with a word, of course, is the evangelical expression, but actually allowing them to forage in the wild. And that means that I suppose congregational members would be directed a lot more to finding God at work in the literature that they're engaged in. Now, I think that will differ for each individual. For a social worker, it'll mean being at the cutting edge of social work theory. For a physicist, it's involved obviously in cutting work of physics. Wherever a person's engaged with the ongoing, I suppose, evolution of thinking within their particular current work environment, I think is where they need to be foraging for their food. Couple of ideas. Any other questions?
Can I chip in again, John?
Yeah.
Another way of looking at it, I think, is from the individual level. One of my favourite ideas is that we're all in Africa one day, and who are the most lively members of the community? The goddamn teenagers, right? These bloody adolescents, they ruin it for everyone. Why do they ruin it? Because they want to do something different. And my idea is that one day the son says to Dad, "Dad, I'm off. I'm crossing the river. I'm heading north, Dad." Dad goes, "No, don't go, son. It's taboo, mate. You'll die. It's terrible. No, I'm heading north. Apparently there are Neanderthals up there. I want to sort them out, Dad. I want to get stuck in." So the idea is that the youth lead us with their energy. They lead us into these places we'd rather not go, actually. We're quite comfy with our white hair and sitting around our fires, and it's nice and comfy. But these youth, they want to get out there and do stuff, And so that brought about the invasion, I reckon, of Europe, and then spreading east towards China, then crossing whatever the strait is called, into America, and then heading south and north through the Eskimos and all that. So what got us out of Africa? Teenagers.
Yeah, and I think you're right there, Michael, that is, I suppose, the normal way evolution happens. It's the young who make the sorts of changes that need to be. I think, though, that the church is in the situation of being a bottleneck population, where it doesn't have many young, and where the young at the moment are attracted, and this is kind of, I suppose, temporary situation, is they're attracted to the more conservative side of the church, which is not going to produce evolution according to the way I've been talking about. So I think it's kind of up to those who, whatever age, are currently in the church, and that means the whole cross section of the church. And I think that that's the way out of a bottleneck population situation. I can't think of any other way. And if we're kind of waiting on the next generation of youth to kind of do it, I think we might be waiting for a long time. I think we just have to seize the opportunity as we see it.
Yep. Yeah, we really need to encourage the youth, I think, to be iconoclasts, to break rules, to do stupid things. You know, we're going to lose a few, of course, you know, and there's crazy driving and all that sort of stuff. But, you know, as you make the point, we lose the odd bilby, but by and large, they, as Amy pointed out, they grow bigger muscles, which is a good thing.
Yeah, we just might be more reliant on the young at heart rather than the young at the moment.
Indeed.
Rosemary, probably a time to call time, I think.
Okay, great. Thank
Thanks,
you,
John.
everyone, for your time and patience.
We're getting close to the end of the recording time, I think, too, or the meeting time. So, yes, thank you very much. It's very interesting things, great deal to think about within that. Yeah.
Yep. Thanks, John.
Okay, thanks,
you.
everyone. Have a
See
great
ya.
afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Well, see you guys.
Bye.